indigenous issues, and we are joined today by expert member Mr. Edward Porokwa, who is a lawyer and a practicing advocate in the courts of Tanzania with a Bachelor of Laws, LLB honors from the University of Dar es Salaam, and a Master's in Business Administration or MBA from Esami Maastricht School of Management. Is also the director of Pastoralist Indigenous NGOs Forum, Pingo's Forum, an umbrella organization for indigenous peoples in Tanzania, with over 25 years of experience working with indigenous peoples organizations and human rights in Africa linked to regional and international indigenous peoples networks. That's quite an introduction. Quite a guy,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Porokwa. Thank you
Yeah,
for
yeah,
joining us today.
yeah.
All right. So this year's theme of the permanent forum is ensuring indigenous people's health, including in the context of conflict. So I want to ask you a question related to indigenous peoples of Africa in particular, and perhaps let's take it a step further and talk about the pastoralists in Tanzania in particular. So can you comment about the state of health on the pastoralists in Tanzania?
Yeah, thank you very much. Indigenous people, particularly in Tanzania and in most of Africa, are marginalized. And that marginalization goes into different sectors, including the health sector. So most of the indigenous people's land do not have the health services. There's a very serious problem in terms of access to health services and the provision of the medical services to the community. However, because indigenous people, and particularly in Tanzania, live close to most of the conservation or protected areas, they are seriously affected by different policies that establish conservation, and recently on topical issues around carbon, extractive minerals, and many other issues. And as a result, they are having a lot of problem in conflict. And that conflict that emanate from their eviction, from their displacement, increase their vulnerability to health services. And because that has also a very close link to issues related to food security, there's a lot of malnutrition that is happening to indigenous people in their lands. Particularly if I start to talk about a very specific issue, which is very globally understood, of which in the last 1 week, 8 special rapporteurs of the UN special mechanism made a statement, the issue of displacement of indigenous people in Ngorongoro conservation area. And this has really started since 2022, when the government announced that the people should move out of that land voluntarily. But that voluntarization of displacing indigenous people started with cutting down the health services. In Ngorongoro, there is only one hospital, for example, which is called Endulen Hospital, where indigenous people can access the health services. Most of indigenous people are accessing services also through church-based flying medical services that rescue pregnant women and children. And because of what the government called voluntary relocation, they stopped providing the people with health services, resulting in increased deterioration of the health of indigenous people, but also curtailing them from accessing pastures, because you are talking about pastoralists.
Yeah.
The pastoralists depend on livestock, and they depend on rangeland. So the moment you displace them from their pastures, you cause serious concern related to health because of malnutrition. About 80% of the health problems emanating from the pastoralist areas are caused by malnutrition and refusal to allow them to access traditional medicines that they are using in absence of the government provided services, which are not available in most cases in areas that indigenous people are living. So for the pastoral, it's not only in one location, but in most of the places they have very serious problem because their livestock are being confiscated. Their land is upgraded into protected areas, and as a result, they have no access to pasture. And when they access their territorial land, they face very serious fines from the government, and most of them have lost a majority of their stock, which they depend on for food, which also increase their health, but also they depend on for buying other things. So definitely the poverty and the increased poverty among indigenous people in many of the African countries, and particularly in Tanzania, is causing very serious health problem for indigenous people.
We have covered the story, especially of the Ngorongoro district, quite extensively over the last few years. And one can only imagine what the people who live there or who have been displaced are going through. So I want to talk to you about the third day of the 25th session. What came out of today? Can you tell us about some of the highlights, please?
What came out, we were discussing an agenda of interactive dialogue with a special rapporteur and a special mechanism. There are a lot of issues that are similar globally on the situation of indigenous people. And one of the things that came out so much was the issue of marginalization and the issue of recognition of indigenous people. And especially in the afternoon session today, there's a lot of issues related to reprisal and forcing indigenous people, silencing indigenous people by the state parties. So you can see a lot of state parties alleging that they don't have indigenous people, which is the commitment within the UN framework of indigenous people. And we can also see a lot of issues coming from indigenous people on the issues related to land and natural resources, issues related to conservation and protected areas, where indigenous people are not being allowed to coexist with the biodiversity. So you can see a lot of discussion around really the less and less observance by the state parties to the UN Declaration on the Right of Indigenous People. So most of the issues coming from indigenous people is like trying to make the governments and state parties accountable for their commitment on human rights. And at the same time, looking at the argument from the state party, you can see some of the state parties completely denying, not only denying recognition of indigenous people, even failing to acknowledge that they are indigenous people, and try to justify whatever claims that are coming from indigenous people that these people are not indigenous people. So you can see really some kind of discussion around issues of indigenous people, and some of the discussion not being constructive. Of course, we acknowledge some of the state parties which are trying to improve their way of working with indigenous people and having very good implementation programs to assist indigenous people, but many of the states are continuing to refuse accountability when it comes to the issue of recognition of indigenous people.
We had a delegation from Botswana earlier today and yesterday, and they were very positive about the government's efforts in recognition. I take it that that's a positive country, positive developments there in Botswana as far as recognition is concerned.
Yeah, definitely in Africa, I think Botswana is making very good progress in terms of recognition of indigenous people, and the president has given very firm commitments to address the issues of indigenous people, and we really commend the government of Botswana even for inviting the special rapporteur to Botswana. They did that, and some of the governments also trying to recognize indigenous people, like the government of Burundi. They have, even in this afternoon, they had a statement on some of the progress that some of the programs that and implementation actions they are doing to the Batwa people. And of course, even the government of Kenya, they did not speak, but the indigenous people in Kenya also amended the last year government framework on indigenous people, which recognize indigenous people in Kenya. But surprisingly, some of the governments are not the same community that appear in Kenya, the Maasai, for example, and in Tanzania, it is the same community. One counterpart is recognizing them as indigenous people, and the other one is saying that we don't have indigenous people. And I think one of the very big issues that we have noticed also in this day is that the kind of description or definition that some states have on indigenous people, because for Africa we are not talking about the issue of aboriginality like how you talk of indigenous people in Australia. We are talking about criteria and characteristic of some community which have historically been marginalized. We are talking of community that have a different way of life from the mainstream community. We are talking of community that self-identify themselves as indigenous people. But if you try to look at the discussion among some of the states that do not recognize indigenous people, they are talking about the first people to be in that place. I think it is different also from Botswana, where the San people could be mentioned as the first people of the Kalahari or any other place around South Africa. But in many of the African countries, it is not really about who came first. It is about meeting the criteria provided by the UN Declaration on the Right of Indigenous and different other mechanisms within the UN system.
I believe that Botswana is exemplary right now. So to all the other states, I know that they are battling with the issue of indigeneity. So Botswana is a very, very good example right now. So that is just my message to states who might be listening to this broadcast. Look at what Botswana is doing. I want to turn to our session again, our 25th session of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. What are the expected outcomes from an expert member's perspective of this year's session?
Probably it might be very early to say the expected outcome, but definitely one of the expected outcome could be having very strong recommendation on the situation that is happening globally, especially that relate to land and natural resources, that relate to the situation that indigenous people are facing in different countries. But we expect also the session to lay down a foundation for an improvement of the situation of indigenous people, because I think while we all celebrate the around close to 20 years of UN Declaration on the Right of Indigenous People, but still we are regressing in many of the issues. We are so much affected by the geopolitics. We are also so much affected by the current issues related to climate change. We are so much affected with issues that are coming out in relation to extractive minerals, and currently the issue of carbon that is likely to be affecting indigenous people. So we expect, and a lot of participants yesterday, today, have been making their statement in relation to the already impact of these global policies that are happening, because it is not only the issue of climate change is a big issue globally at the moment, but we are equally affected by the interventions that are addressing issues of climate change. And even in our country, and the state are more and more using climate change as justification for investment, for tourism, for conservation, but not conservation, because that is not conservation. You remove the pastoralist and you give the same land to a hunter, a professional hunter. You remove the pastoralists and establish hotels for tourism. You are talking about money. It is not really about conservation. It is about what the states are interested on. And the most important thing that many of the states are interested in is the issue of money. It is what brings money into the economy. Carbon is now not looked as a way to address issues of climate change, but as a way to increase funding into the pocket, into the government treasuries. So I think those are the issues that we expect to have resolutions on at the end of the session. That will really clarify and provide an opportunity to indigenous people to put forward all these issues.
Thank you so much for coming to talk to us today. That is my final question. I want to just say thank you for your time, and you're welcome at the Indigenous Media Zone anytime.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.